December 22nd, 1944. The winter morning broke gray and hostile over the Belgian Ardennes, the kind of morning when breath turned to frost before it left a man's lungs. In a farmhouse 5 miles west of Bastogne, General Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz unfolded a map across a wooden table scarred by rifle butts and boot heels. The paper crackled in the cold. Around him, officers of the XL7 Panzer Corps stood in their greatcoats, their faces ruddy with confidence. Outside, the howl of wind through bare trees carried the distant percussion of artillery. American artillery, growing fainter by the hour. Lüttwitz traced his finger around the crossroads town marked in the center of the map, a town that held 7 roads like the spokes of a wheel. His divisions had closed the ring the night before. 26,000 Volksgrenadiers, Panzer battalions, Panzer Grenadiers from the elite divisions. They had surrounded 15,000 Americans with artillery, armor, and the certainty that comes from overwhelming numerical superiority. The general looked up at his staff. "Bastogne cannot hold," he said. Not a prediction. A statement of military mathematics. The room smelled of damp wool and old smoke, and the particular staleness that comes from men who have lived too long in winter quarters. On the floor, a pool of melted snow spread from tracked-in boots. In the corner, a kerosene heater sputtered. These were seasoned officers, veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had learned the brutal arithmetic of encirclement warfare. They had seen Stalingrad from the German perspective, had watched the Sixth Army disappear into the Volga winter. But this was not Stalingrad. This was Belgium, and the men inside Bastogne were not the Wehrmacht of 1942. They were Americans, and von Lüttwitz was about to learn the difference. He called for his aide to prepare a surrender ultimatum. The words would be formal, even courteous. The threat would be absolute: 2 hours to surrender, or face annihilation from massed artillery. It was, the general believed, a mercy. He expected the Americans to be grateful for the opportunity to save their lives. But 5 miles away, in a cellar beneath the Hotel Lebrun in Bastogne's town square, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was eating cold beans from a can. The 101st Airborne's acting commander, his division commander was in Washington, caught there when the German offensive exploded, sat on an ammunition crate. Around him, staff officers worked by candlelight, plotting defensive positions on maps pinned to stone walls that had stood since the Middle Ages. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed men, and coffee boiled from grounds used 3 times already. McAuliffe was 46 years old, an artilleryman by training, a paratrooper by circumstance. He had jumped into Normandy 6 months earlier. He had fought through the Netherlands. His men called him Old Croc, not with disrespect, but with the affection soldiers reserve for commanders who don't waste their lives. When his operations officer woke him with news that German envoys had arrived under a white flag, McAuliffe's first words were a muttered curse that would become legend, though history would record it more politely. He read the surrender demand. He read the part about imprudent arrogance and honorable surrender, and the threat of annihilation. Then he crumpled the paper and said something brief and profane. His staff suggested he formalize the response. Thus was born the single word that would define American defiance: nuts. History pivots on such moments, not the grand proclamations of statesmen or the elaborate strategies of supreme commanders, but the gut reactions of tired men in frozen cellars who refuse to accept the logic of their situation. The German generals believed they had created an inescapable trap. They had done the mathematics. They controlled the roads. They had cut the telephone lines. They commanded the high ground. Their forces outnumbered the defenders 5-1. They possessed armor and artillery and the momentum of 6 days of successful offensive operations. The weather: thick clouds, freezing rain, ground fog, grounded Allied aircraft, neutralizing American air superiority. Every military calculation said Bastogne must fall. Every historical precedent of siege warfare suggested the surrounded garrison would recognize reality and save themselves. The Germans had offered honorable terms. They expected acceptance. What von Lüttwitz and his staff could not calculate, what no amount of operational planning could account for, was the transformation that had occurred in the American soldier between 1941 and 1944. The green recruits who had stumbled through North Africa had become the veterans who stormed Omaha Beach. The paratroopers who had scattered across Normandy's hedgerows had learned to fight outnumbered and win. The tank crews who had broken out at St. Lo had discovered that American industrial might meant something profound when translated into the practical reality of supply and firepower. The German generals saw the numbers: 15,000 surrounded men, limited ammunition, minimal food, no winter clothing adequate for the Ardennes December. What they did not see, what they could not imagine from their Eastern Front experience, was that these American soldiers had been raised in a nation where abundance was the baseline of existence, where logistical impossibility was merely a problem to be solved, where the assumption of ultimate victory was baked into every training manual and every replacement shipment and every aerial resupply drop. The morning after McAuliffe sent his one-word reply, the fighting intensified. German artillery, the 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions von Lüttwitz had threatened to unleash, hammered Bastogne's perimeter. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the north. Elements of Panzer Lehr Division probed from the east. The 5th Parachute Division tested the southern defenses. They came in the fog, gray shapes materializing from tree lines, the distinctive silhouette of Panzer IV tanks, and the hunched forms of Panzer Grenadiers advancing through frozen fields. The Americans met them with everything they had: 105 mm howitzers firing over open sights directly at approaching armor, machine guns positioned in the upper floors of half-destroyed buildings, bazookas teams crawling through snow to engage tanks at 50 yards, artillery batteries coordinating defensive fires with a precision that spoke of months of practice and unlimited ammunition expenditure in training. The 101st Airborne had been rushed to Bastogne without their full equipment. Many men lacked winter overshoes. Some had only summer-weight uniforms under their field jackets. They had brought 3 days of rations and whatever ammunition they could carry. But they also brought something the Germans had not encountered before: an absolute confidence that resupply would come, that reinforcement would arrive, that somewhere above the clouds American aircraft were waiting for the weather to clear, that somewhere to the south American armor was already rolling north. This confidence was not misplaced. 100 miles south, at 3rd Army Headquarters in Luxembourg, General George S. Patton, Jr. was executing a maneuver that would be studied in military academies for generations. On December 19th, 3 days into the German offensive, Patton had met with Supreme Commander Eisenhower and other Allied generals at Verdun. While others proposed cautious responses, Patton announced he could attack north with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals thought he was engaging in characteristic bravado. He was not. He had already ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans. He had already identified the pivot point. Now, he gave the order to execute what military historians would call one of the most remarkable redeployments in the history of warfare. The Third Army would disengage from its offensive operations in the Saar, wheel 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration. This meant moving over 133,000 men and 11,000 vehicles over icy roads through the worst winter weather in decades. It meant coordinating movement on a scale that required perfect staff work, flawless execution, and an assumption of mobility that only a fully mechanized, fully supplied modern army could contemplate. The Germans did not believe it was possible. Their intelligence officers, when they detected the Third Army's movement, assumed it was a feint or a limited redeployment of a few divisions. The concept that an entire field army could disengage from active combat, turn 90 degrees, march more than 100 miles in winter conditions, and attack with full strength within 72 hours violated everything they knew about operational reality. In their experience on the Eastern Front, such a movement would take weeks of preparation, would require extensive logistical buildup, would leave units strung out and vulnerable. They calculated based on their own capabilities, their own dwindling fuel stocks, their own exhausted transportation network. They did not account for American logistics, for the endless convoys of trucks bringing fuel and ammunition, for the depot system that could forward supplies faster than combat units could consume them, for the sheer material abundance of an economy that was producing more tanks and aircraft and artillery shells than the rest of the world combined. Patton understood what his German counterparts did not, that modern mechanized warfare had become as much a contest of logistics as of tactics, and that America's industrial capacity had tilted that contest irrevocably. But even Patton, supreme pragmatist, could not control the weather. As the Third Army turned north, the skies opened. Freezing rain turned roads to ice. Sleet reduced visibility to yards. Snowdrifts blocked secondary routes. And worst of all, the same foul weather that grounded Allied aircraft allowed German forces to move and resupply without fear of air attack. Patton called it Hitler weather, the meteorological shield that gave the Wehrmacht its last chance. On December 8th, knowing that clear skies were essential for his armor to advance and for air support to strike German positions, Patton summoned his Third Army chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill. The conversation has been documented in multiple sources, acquiring in the retelling a quality somewhere between history and legend. But the essential facts remain. Patton asked for a prayer for good weather. The chaplain demurred, noting that it was not customary to pray for weather to kill fellow men. Patton replied with characteristic bluntness that soldiers had been praying for good weather since the Crusades, and O'Neill should write something appropriate. The chaplain composed what became known as Patton's Weather Prayer. Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee, of Thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon Thee that, armed with Thy power, we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies, and establish Thy justice among men and nations. Patton ordered the prayer printed on cards and distributed to every man in Third Army. Over 250,000 prayers went out. Whether through divine intervention or simple meteorological chance, the weather began to clear on December 23rd. The skies opened. The temperature plummeted, freezing the mud solid, turning the roads into highways for armor. And the Allied air forces, grounded for a week, launched the largest tactical air support operation in the European theater. In Bastogne, the defenders heard the aircraft before they saw them. The drone of engines, hundreds of them, high above the overcast, then breaks in the clouds, and through those gaps came the C-47 Skytrains, flying low and slow, their cargo doors open. Bundles tumbled out, parachutes blossoming red and green and white, descending into the perimeter like manna. Medical supplies, ammunition, artillery shells by the ton, and food. The symbolic power of that food cannot be understated. The defenders of Bastogne had been eating K-rations when they had anything at all. Compressed biscuits and tinned meat that had to be thawed against body heat before it could be chewed. Now came hot meal components, coffee, cigarettes, and in one celebrated drop, Christmas dinners complete with turkey and canned cranberry sauce. The contrast was not lost on anyone. American soldiers, surrounded and outnumbered, received resupply from the sky, while German forces scrounged for fuel and subsisted on diminishing rations. The message was clear. America's industrial might could reach anywhere, could sustain any operation, could turn logistical impossibility into mere inconvenience. The German soldiers watching from their positions in the tree lines surrounding Bastogne saw those supply drops with something approaching incomprehension. They had been promised that the offensive would capture Allied supply depots, that the fuel and food of the Americans would sustain the Wehrmacht's drive to Antwerp. Instead, they watched supplies descend from the sky in quantities that mocked their own shortages. Since 1943, the German war economy had been contracting. Ersatz substitutes replaced real materials. Rations diminished. The eastern and western fronts consumed men and equipment faster than factories could replace them. The soldiers attacking Bastogne were themselves short of ammunition, rationed to specific shell allocations per gun per day. Their tanks moved cautiously to preserve fuel. Their rations consisted of hard bread and thin soup. And here were Americans, surrounded and supposedly defeated, receiving supplies as if from an inexhaustible cornucopia. It was, in its way, more demoralizing than combat. But Patton's army was not waiting for air supply to win the battle. On December 22nd, the same day, McAuliffe sent his nuts reply. The 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army attacked north toward Bastogne. The division's commander, Major General Hugh Gaffey, gave Combat Command R the mission to break through to the surrounded garrison. Leading the spearhead was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the same Abrams who would later have the main battle tank of the U.S. Army named in his honor. His 37th Tank Battalion, supported by armored infantry, advanced through a corridor of German resistance that grew fiercer with every mile. The German defenders were not the spent force of popular imagination. These were veteran units, dug in, fighting with the desperation of men who knew defeat was approaching. They had anti-tank guns positioned on every ridgeline. They had infantry with Panzerfausts waiting in cellars and behind hedgerows. They had minefields sown in depth across the approaches. And they had orders to hold at all costs, because Hitler himself had decreed that Bastogne must be taken, that the offensive depended on controlling those 7 roads. The fighting through the villages south of Bastogne entered military legend for its intensity. Chaumont, Bégonville, Warden, small Belgian farming communities became battlefields where American tanks and German anti-tank guns destroyed each other at ranges measured in yards. The snow was churned to mud mixed with spent shell casings and frozen blood. Farmhouses that had stood for centuries burned. The civilian population, those who had not fled, huddled in cellars while armor battled in their streets. Every village had to be taken building by building, every crossroads contested, every bridge either captured intact or rebuilt under fire. The 4th Armored Division's casualties mounted, men killed and wounded in the kind of close-quarters fighting where technical superiority mattered less than raw determination. And behind the lead elements, the division's logistics tail kept pace, trucks bringing forward fuel and ammunition, recovery vehicles pulling damaged tanks back for repair. The entire apparatus of American mechanized warfare functioning in conditions that would have paralyzed a lesser force. On December 26th, 4 days into the relief operation, Abrams' column approached the village of Assenois, 3 miles south of Bastogne. Intelligence indicated light German presence. Intelligence was wrong. The village held 2 companies of Volksgrenadiers with anti-tank guns positioned to cover the approaches. This was the final obstacle. Beyond Assenois, the road ran straight to Bastogne's perimeter. Abrams made the decision that defined his career. He would not stop to reduce the German position methodically. He would attack through. At 1600 hours on December 26th, under a clear winter sky with the temperature well below freezing, the 37th Tank Battalion charged into Assenois with all guns firing. At the head of the column was an M4A3E2 Sherman Jumbo, a heavily armored assault variant designated C7, nicknamed Cobra King by her crew. She mounted a 75 mm gun and carried armor thick enough to shrug off most German anti-tank weapons. Her commander was First Lieutenant Charles Boggess. As Cobra King entered Assenois, every German weapon in the village opened fire. The next 20 minutes were chaos, recorded in after-action reports but impossible to fully capture in clinical military language. Cobra King's 75mm gun traversed constantly, firing high-explosive shells into buildings where muzzle flashes betrayed German positions. Behind her, more Shermans and half-tracks loaded with armored infantry poured into the village, firing on the move, infantry dismounting to clear houses while armor suppressed German positions. The village became a maelstrom of tracer fire and explosions, of tank cannons firing at point-blank range and infantry fighting room to room. German Panzerfaust teams, soldiers with single-shot anti-tank rockets, emerged from cellars and alleyways only to be cut down by machine gun fire. American and German wounded lay in the snow, bleeding into the frozen ground while the battle raged around them. Buildings burned, a church steeple collapsed, and through it all, Cobra King pushed forward, her engine roaring, her tracks crushing debris, her commander standing in the turret calling directions to his driver while machine gun bullets sparked off the armor around him. Lieutenant Bogus later reported that he navigated by compass bearing and instinct, driving through smoke and snow toward where he believed the American perimeter must be. Behind him, the village of Assenois was still burning, still contested, but the critical penetration had been made. At approximately 1650 hours, as the winter twilight turned the snow blue, Cobra King emerged from the smoke and carnage of Assenois onto the open ground south of Bastogne. Ahead, through the gathering dusk, Bogus could see American positions, foxholes and machine gun emplacements, and the burned-out hulks of German tanks from failed attacks. He radioed, "This is 37th Tank Battalion, Combat Command R, 4th Armored Division. Come here." From the foxholes, soldiers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion rose, waving, shouting, firing green flares that arced into the darkening sky. First Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the Engineers ran toward Cobra King, his face split by a grin despite 7 days of siege. Bogus dismounted. The two officers shook hands in the snow while around them, American soldiers from Patton's 3rd Army and the 101st Airborne embraced, slapped backs, shared cigarettes. The emotional release of men who had believed they might die surrounded, and who now knew they would not. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The corridor was narrow, barely a mile wide, under German fire from both flanks, contested every hour of every day for weeks to come. But it was open. Wounded men could be evacuated, supplies could be trucked in, reinforcements could arrive. The tactical situation remained difficult, but the strategic equation had shifted irrevocably. The German offensive had been predicated on speed, on reaching the Meuse River before Allied forces could respond, on splitting the British and American armies and capturing the port of Antwerp. Every day, the 101st Airborne held Bastogne was a day the German timetable slipped. Every hour Patton's 3rd Army battered the southern flank was an hour German reserves had to be diverted from the main effort. When Cobra King made contact with the Bastogne garrison, the Battle of the Bulge was not over. It would rage for another month. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The high-water mark of the German offensive had passed. In the farmhouse where General von Lüttwitz had confidently traced his finger around the map of surrounded Bastogne, the mood had darkened. Reports came in of American armor breaking through at Assenois. Reports of massive American airstrikes hitting German supply columns. Reports of the 3rd Army's full weight turning into the German flank. The general had done his military mathematics correctly. 15,000 Americans surrounded by overwhelming force should have surrendered. But he had failed to account for the immeasurable factors. He had not calculated the psychological weight of knowing that somewhere reinforcement was coming. He had not considered that American soldiers had been trained in a military culture where logistical support was assumed, where calling for artillery or air support was routine, where the concept of being truly cut off from supply was almost unimaginable. He had not understood that the one-word reply, "nuts," represented more than defiance. It represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy, in national character, in the baseline assumptions about what was possible and what was not. The contrast was symbolized in 1,000 small ways, but perhaps most powerfully in the matter of food. In his Christmas message to the 101st Airborne, General McAuliffe recounted the German surrender demand and then noted, "Allied troops are counterattacking in force. We continue to hold Bastogne. By holding Bastogne, we assure the success of the Allied armies." Then he added, "The Germans actually did surround us. Their commander demanded our surrender in the following impudent arrogance. We replied to them as follows: nuts." But beneath the famous reply was a deeper truth, evident to every soldier who participated. When American forces were surrounded, the question was never if relief would come, but when. The defenders of Bastogne did not debate whether to surrender. They debated how to stretch their ammunition, where to position their last tank destroyers, how to maximize the effectiveness of their artillery with limited shells, and they waited with cold confidence for Patton to arrive. Because that was the pattern. That was the American way of war. You held and reinforcement came. You called for artillery and fire missions were delivered. You requested air support, and once the weather cleared, the sky filled with aircraft. The logistical and industrial foundation of American military power was so reliable that it became invisible to those who benefited from it, as fundamental and unconsidered as gravity. German soldiers, by contrast, had spent years learning to operate without that certainty. On the Eastern Front, encircled units were often lost, supplies rarely arrived, reinforcement was uncertain. The German military tradition emphasized individual initiative, small unit independence, the ability to fight effectively even when cut off from higher command. These were valuable qualities, born of necessity. But they also reflected a different baseline reality. The Wehrmacht in 1944 was a force operating at the end of extended supply lines, with dwindling resources against enemies that had grown stronger while Germany grew weaker. The soldiers attacking Bastogne were veterans, skilled, brave, fighting with determination. But they were also men who had learned that when ammunition ran low, you could not simply call for more, that when fuel was exhausted, the offensive ended regardless of tactical opportunity, that when rations diminished, you went hungry. They were soldiers of a nation that had mobilized its economy totally for war, and was discovering that total mobilization could not match the industrial output of an American economy that was, even in 1944, producing consumer goods alongside military equipment. The symbolic object that recurred throughout the Bastogne narrative was neither weapon nor flag, but the K-ration, the American combat field ration that consisted of 3 small boxes containing biscuits, canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, and instant coffee. To modernize, K-rations seem barely adequate. To the defenders of Bastogne, they represented something profound. When supplies ran low during the siege, soldiers divided K-rations to stretch them further. 1 box became 2 meals. Water was heated over sterno tablets to make weak coffee from grounds used twice. Chocolate bars were saved for the men in the most exposed foxholes. And yet, even as they rationed carefully, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne knew that above them, waiting for the weather to clear, were transport aircraft loaded with supplies. They knew that behind them, the vast apparatus of American logistics was churning, that depots were stocked, that convoys were moving, that the question was not whether food would arrive, but only when the clouds would break. When the air supply drops finally came on December 23rd, when parachutes descended carrying not just ammunition and medical supplies, but also rations and coffee and cigarettes, the message was unmistakable. America could sustain its forces anywhere, under any conditions, against any opposition. The German soldiers watching those supply drops understood the message. In their own knapsacks, rations grew sparse. Bread was days old, frozen hard. Sausage was carefully portioned. Hot food was a memory from rear areas. And here were Americans, supposedly defeated, receiving from the sky more supplies in an hour than a German battalion might see in a week. It was a form of psychological warfare more effective than propaganda. It demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that the material balance of the war had shifted beyond recovery. Germany could still fight with skill and courage. German soldiers could still win tactical victories, could still defend tenaciously, could still launch local counterattacks. But they could not match the logistical weight that America brought to every battlefield. Every K-ration that descended by parachute into Bastogne was a small demonstration of industrial superiority. Every artillery barrage, American gunners firing without regard to ammunition constraints because more shells were always arriving, was a lesson in the mathematics of production. Every American tank destroyed that was replaced within days taught the same truth. In a war of attrition between American industry and German resolve, only one outcome was possible. Patton understood this. His famous aggressiveness, his insistence on attack, his impatience with delay, all stemmed from a clear recognition that American strength was logistical. Speed meant arriving before the enemy could dig in. Aggressive pursuit meant giving the enemy no time to recover. Constant pressure meant the Wehrmacht's limited resources were consumed faster than they could be replaced. The relief of Bastogne was not just a tactical success or an operational victory, it was a strategic demonstration. It showed that American forces could respond to crisis with speed and weight, that German offensives could not achieve surprise sufficient to prevent American countermeasures, that the logistical foundation of American power was so robust that even dramatic tactical reverses could be overcome within days. The German generals had gambled that they could destroy significant American forces before reinforcement arrived, that they could capture supply depots and use American logistics against the Americans, that speed and surprise could overcome material disadvantage. They were wrong on every count. In the years after the war, participants on both sides wrote their memoirs and gave their interviews, and certain themes recurred. American veterans spoke of the cold, of the fear, of watching German attacks emerge from fog and tree lines, of the weight of responsibility for defending positions that could not be allowed to fall. But underneath those narratives was an assumption so fundamental it often went unspoken, that they would be supplied, that reinforcement would come, that the industrial might of America stood behind them. German veterans spoke of the same cold, the same fear, the same weight of responsibility. But their narratives carried a different assumption, that supplies were limited, that ammunition must be conserved, that if the offensive failed, there would be no second chance, because the resources to launch it did not exist. One side fought with the confidence of abundance. The other fought with the desperation of scarcity. Both sides displayed courage. Both sides suffered. But only one side had K-rations descending from the sky when food ran low. The transformation in perception occurred gradually, then suddenly. On December 16th, when the German offensive exploded through the Ardennes, Wehrmacht soldiers advanced with something approaching their old confidence. They had been promised success. They had been told that one final great effort would split the Allies, recapture Antwerp, force a negotiated peace. For 6 days, the offensive made progress. American units retreated or were surrounded. The maps at German headquarters showed the Bulge and Allied lines growing. And then came Bastogne. The crossroads that was supposed to fall in a day held for a week. The garrison that was supposed to surrender with gratitude when offered terms replied with an obscenity. The town that was encircled and cut off received supplies from the sky. And the relief force that was supposed to be impossibly far away arrived in 72 hours and smashed through the encirclement with an armored column that fought at the speed of mechanized warfare. The German generals had believed Bastogne was beaten. They had done the calculations. They had written the surrender ultimatum with confidence. And then reality, American reality, with its different baseline assumptions about logistics and mobility and industrial support, had demonstrated that their calculations were based on incomplete data. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote that the failure to capture Bastogne was the fundamental cause of the offensive's failure. He was correct, but not in the way he meant. Bastogne mattered not because of its 7 roads, though those were important. It mattered because its defense demonstrated that American forces could not be defeated by encirclement alone, that logistics and industrial might had created a new kind of warfare where surrounded garrisons could be sustained indefinitely and relieved within days. It mattered because the speed of Patton's relief operation showed that American mechanized forces could redeploy faster than German operational planning assumed possible. It mattered because the entire sequence, the defiant refusal to surrender, the aerial resupply, the armored breakthrough, became a story that resonated through both armies, teaching one side that resistance was never hopeless, and teaching the other that even tactical successes could be reversed by American material superiority. On January 16, 1945, 3 weeks after Cobra King broke through to Bastogne, American forces eliminated the last German penetrations and restored the original front lines. The Battle of the Bulge was over. It had cost the Americans over 80,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 killed. It had cost the Germans even more heavily, and worse, it had cost them their last reserves of armor and trained infantry. The divisions that attacked through the Ardennes in December 1944 were destroyed in January 1945. They could not be reconstituted. The fuel expended could not be replaced. The ammunition fired could not be resupplied. Germany had gambled everything on one offensive and lost not just the battle, but the capability to defend when the inevitable Allied counteroffensive came in the spring. The Americans, by contrast, absorbed their casualties, brought forward replacement soldiers and equipment, and prepared to resume the attack. The same logistical system that had sustained the defense of Bastogne and enabled Patton's relief operation now pivoted to support renewed offensive operations. Within weeks, American forces were advancing again. Within months, they were crossing the Rhine. The material foundation that had made the relief of Bastogne possible made everything that followed possible. The epilogue to Bastogne was written not in military dispatches, but in the quiet recognition by soldiers on both sides of what the battle had meant. For American veterans, Bastogne became the symbol of resilience, of holding against odds, of the absolute confidence that reinforcement would arrive because it always did. The story of McAuliffe's nuts reply entered American military lore not just as a moment of defiance, but as a crystallization of American character. The refusal to accept defeat, the confidence bordering on arrogance, the assumption that any problem could be overcome with sufficient determination and resources. For German veterans, Bastogne represented the moment when the illusions ended, when the hope of turning the war's tide faded, when the reality of facing an enemy with unlimited material resources and the will to use them became undeniable. They had surrounded an American force and discovered that surrounding was not enough. They had cut supply lines and watched supplies arrive from the sky. They had calculated victory and been defeated by factors their calculations did not include. In the decades after the war, historians would debate tactics and strategies, would analyze decisions and critique operations. But for those who fought at Bastogne, the battle's meaning was simpler and more profound. It demonstrated that modern warfare had become inseparable from industrial warfare, that the nation which could produce more tanks and aircraft and artillery shells and K-rations would prevail over the nation that could not, regardless of tactical skill or operational artistry or strategic genius. It showed that the American way of war, unglamorous, logistics-focused, reliant on material superiority rather than martial tradition, was suited to the kind of total war that the 20th century demanded, and it established a truth that would shape military thinking for generations: that logistics is strategy, that the ability to sustain forces in the field is more valuable than the ability to achieve tactical surprise, that the quartermaster and the supply sergeant are as essential to victory as the most decorated combat. Commander, the K-ration, that small cardboard box of compressed biscuits and tinned meat, became in memory a symbol of American power more potent than any weapon. Because it represented abundance where the enemy faced scarcity. Because it descended from cloudy skies when it was most needed. Because it said, more clearly than any declaration, that American soldiers would be supplied, would be sustained, would be reinforced, would never be abandoned to their fate no matter how desperate the situation appeared. The German generals believed Bastogne was beaten because military mathematics said it was. They did not account for a different kind of mathematics, one where the equation included the output of factories in Detroit and the capacity of transport aircraft, and the determination of a nation that had decided wars were won by production as much as by fighting. When Lieutenant Bogus and Lieutenant Webster shook hands in the snow south of Bastogne, as twilight gathered on December 26, 1944, they marked not just the relief of a surrounded garrison but the vindication of a way of war that married industrial might to military skill and made both irresistible. The freedom that Bastogne defended was not abstract. It was the freedom of democracies to organize their economies for total war without surrendering their fundamental character. It was the freedom of soldiers to expect support from their nation, to believe that their sacrifice mattered enough, that every resource would be committed to their survival and victory. It was the freedom that came from abundance, from living in a society that could produce both weapons and consumer goods, that could mobilize for war without starving its citizens, that could send its soldiers overseas with the confidence that they carried behind them the full weight of the world's most productive economy. The German generals believed they faced an army. They did not understand they faced an industrial system embodied in soldiers, a logistics network made flesh, an economic model that translated steel mills and assembly lines and agricultural surplus into combat power that could not be defeated by operational skill alone. In the frozen winter of 1944, in the Ardennes forests where the trees were shattered by shellfire and the snow was stained with blood, the future of warfare became clear. The side with the most K-rations, the most trucks, the most fuel, the most shells, the most replacement soldiers would win. Courage mattered, training mattered, leadership mattered, but logistics mattered most. Patton's Third Army arrived through a blizzard, not because American soldiers were braver than German soldiers, but because American logistics could sustain a 90-degree pivot and a 100-mile advance in winter conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne not because paratroopers were tougher than Volksgrenadiers, but because American paratroopers believed in resupply the way other soldiers believed in their rifles. The siege was broken not by tactical genius, but by the grinding, inexorable application of material superiority, organized by competent staff work and executed by soldiers who assumed success because they had never known their nation to fail them in provision and supply. This was the lesson the German generals learned too late, that in the democracy they had dismissed as weak and divided, in the industrial system they had underestimated, in the logistical apparatus they had failed to appreciate. They faced an enemy that had transformed the nature of war itself. Wars were no longer won by the army with the best soldiers, or the most brilliant generals, or the most inspiring ideology. Wars were won by the nation that could keep its soldiers supplied, that could replace losses faster than they occurred, that could turn factories into weapons and farms into field rations and national wealth into strategic mobility. Bastogne was surrounded. The German generals believed it was beaten. And then Patton's army arrived through a blizzard, and the impossible became merely difficult, and the difficult became accomplished fact, and the lesson was written in the snow for anyone with eyes to see. Abundance is its own form of warfare, and in that war, America had already won.